And thank you so much for taking the time to come over to the Heritage Foundation this Monday to discuss Dr. Sarah Kreps' new book, Taxing Wars, which is here. And I was telling a few people that this is my version and you cannot steal it because it's clearly mine because it has a bunch of notes in it. Not that they will be much valuable to you. And thank you so much, Dr. Kreps, for making your way south here to talk to us. And Dr. Kreps is a professor of government and adjunct professor of Cornell. No longer adjunct, right? Yeah. Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Yeah. Perfect. She's a professor at Cornell. Uh, yeah, and she's the author of 4 books, and the most recent one, Taxing Wars, which we're going to be discussing here. Uh, Her other books, 2 were on drones. One is named Drones: What Everyone Needs to Know, and and Drone Warfare. So if you have questions about drones afterwards, save them for the very end. And her first book was called Coalitions of Convenience: United States Military Interventions After the Cold War, where she analyzed military interventions carried out over the last decade. She's widely published in both academic journals and media outlets, and Google will help you a lot to guide her through her work. She also has a good website that will inform you of anything that you need on that. Dr. Kreps is a Air Force veteran and has held fellowships at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, University of Virginia Miller Center for Public Affairs, at the Council for Foreign Relations, where she is still a life member. She has a BA from Harvard, MSc from Oxford, and PhD from Georgetown. And she'll speak about her book for 15 to 20 minutes, and she has slides as well that you all can follow. Then I'll ask her a few questions. And while I ask her questions, please think of your own questions to ask her, and I'll open up for audience. Without further ado, Dr. Sarah Kerr.
Thank you. It is great to be here. I grew up in the DC area, and I'm not just saying this, full transparency. Heritage is the first think tank I was familiar with because it was the 80s. And my dad was a hardcore Republican. So he's like, the one think tank you need to know about is Heritage, full stop. So here I am all these years later. So it's great to be here. I am. So I wanted to just give a few framing remarks about the book. Some of you have read it maybe less thoroughly than Fred. I was a little bit daunted by all of the notes that he's taken on the book. So I want to say a few things about kind of how I came about this topic and sort of what the contents and argument are. So it actually came about because I was corresponding with a colleague who works on Latin America, and he was talking about the Colombian war with the FARC and the security tax that they had levied to finance this war. And I kind of, as a scholar of American military and defense policy, sort of scratched my head like, oh, security tax to pay for war. That's interesting. We don't really have those where I come from. And so I started looking at this question of sort of how do we pay for wars? And it was interesting to me because it used to be that the United States would finance its wars through war taxes. And that really has kind of gone by the wayside. And so I wanted to really unpack this. Like, what are these trends? Why have we shifted the way we do things? And what are the implications for it? And so that's what I'm going to talk about in the next 15 or so minutes, give or take. Talk a little bit about kind of how what wars that we're talking about and why it matters how we pay for them. Kind of the theoretical arguments about how you could finance wars if not through taxes. What are the alternatives? The trends, the historical trends that I looked at quite closely in my book, and thinking about these implications for how democracies fight wars. And then kind of what do we do about it? What is the policy challenge here? And I say challenge for good reason. I think it really is a challenge. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at fairly costly wars. So when you can see, I know a lot of you kind of look at these kinds of costs very carefully. And if you do, you know that it's very difficult to parse what the actual costs are of these wars. But they sort of range in the roughly $2 trillion to $6 trillion, which starts to sound like real money. And when you kind of rank these recent wars, they are the most expensive after World War II. And so it's a non-trivial amount of cost here that we're talking about. And so the question is kind of how could we finance these, and what is contributing to these? And so the big ones, even if it's difficult to parse, the big drivers of these costs, of course, have been the Afghanistan war and the Iraq war. And so these are, again, estimates, but they sort of have contributed to this ballpark of costs. So how does the U.S. pay for wars? Well, there have been a number of ways over the years that are more complicated than these two main ways, the borrowing and the taxation options, like impressment, where this is a sort of an old school way, you could just sort of basically steal someone else's troops and force them to work for you. We don't really do much of that anymore. But what we have done, what we do exclusively now, is we borrow, but that's to be contrasted with taxation. And the way in which these two forms of finance take place has important implications, not just politically, socially, economically, all of these. So I want to pause a little bit and unpack that a little bit. So borrowing, kind of the upshot of all this is that borrowing is, you might think, well, we have to legislation to raise the debt ceiling, that's really complicated, but still, side by side with taxing, borrowing is the more straightforward measure. So generally, you can just kind of continue to borrow and accrue debt, and there tends to be less sort of political debate to that. So the one way to do this is, or one cost of this is these intergenerational inequities. And I don't want to get much into the sort of social kind of part of this and focus. I can talk about that more in the Q&A, but to focus more on the political side of this and the reason why there have been these shifts. And so one of the very attractive things, if you're a politician, is that this is a relatively straightforward thing to do, and you don't have to pay much electoral cost for this. This is much more easily understood if you contrast it with taxation. And so what are the advantages of taxation? Well, so some people, John Maynard Keynes in the Second World War, when he was advising the British government, had advised this because this was a way to sort of create better sort of intergenerational equities. But he was very much interested in the sort of progressive taxation issue. So that was a way to spread the cost of a war based on the ability of individuals within society to pay. Now, given the recognition of where I am at Heritage, I would also just say that Adam Smith, back in 1776, was a big proponent of taxes for wars because it gave, this is the key accountability thing. So what he knew, and as to why this was an attractive way to do it, is that if you tax people, they would be very aware of the conduct of that conflict. And this was kind of how I came about this topic, is that, if you think about accountability linkages, you think about what feels pain to you. It feels pain when you're having to pay taxes. And so there's this really interesting quote from the World War I taxation, where the Washington Post said that every morning when you wake up, from the second you wake up to the second you go to sleep at night, you're aware basically everything they did during that you would do in a course of that day was taxed in a way that reminded you of this ongoing war. And so one sort of theoretical virtue of taxes is, in fact, their unpopularity. So the fact that this was Adam Smith saying the fact that these are unpopular meant that leaders would be held accountable when they initiated these taxes. Unfortunately, though, you can see how this kind of creates a pernicious cycle. I want to, though, before I get to that, draw this accountability linkage. So this is, again, you're getting across kind of this intellectual spectrum. So this is Immanuel Kant. What made democracies different was that they would pass along these costs to the public in blood and treasure. And since their consent was required, leaders would be more conscious of the kinds of wars they were initiating and conducting because they would have this accountability with the public. And so, of course, the inverse of this is true. If the public is not bearing these costs, sort of what incentive do they have anymore to put pressure on leaders to keep wars short and low cost? And so that's kind of the fundamental accountability linkage, insofar as the public is bearing these costs, their consent is required for war, that leaders would therefore be more accountable. And what's interesting about this, I think, you don't need you're like getting a headache right here looking at this, but what I wanted to just show you is this column here, the war tax column. What I want to show you is that really until recently, wars have had war taxes. And so that's the column second from the right, which is war tax years. And you can see that there was an isolated case, the Mexican-American War, relatively brief, that did not have war costs. But every other war has had war taxes. And so this is sort of operating as exactly as Kant would have expected, which is that this is the democratic foundation of conflict. The public is getting the cost passed along to it. It's kind of making these cost-benefit calculations. Is this war important? If so, I'm willing to pay for it. If not, I'm going to put pressure on leaders to bring these wars to a close. But as you can see, more recently, we have not had a war tax since the Vietnam War. And so I was kind of curious why this was going on and what the experience more recently has been. So every so often in the recent wars that I had kind of kicked this off with, there have been initiatives to redress that. And so this was just one example from 2009. It was the Share the Sacrifice Act. And it's basically getting at this accountability issue. The problem in this country, you can read for yourselves, but that basically people are detached from these wars. They have no connection with them. And so this member of Congress was trying to create an awareness of these conflicts. And he was doing that in part by trying to initiate a war tax. Well, if you were around this time, or maybe you were aware or not aware of it, because both parties basically tried to brush this under the rug as quickly as possible. Not just, on both sides. There's a bipartisan antipathy toward this. So the Republican side, these are just representative comments. Americans are already being taxed to death. And this line I liked from the Washington Post, E.J. Dionne. Democrats ran away from this idea as fast as you can say the words Republican majority. This is just kind of a political loser. Nancy Pelosi, who was in 2007, when this member of Congress had initiated his first set of war tax proposals, said, just to be clear, this is not a Democratic proposal, very much distancing herself from this idea. So the question is why we've seen this shift, and I want to do a deep dive into this. You can read it in the book, but I just kind of want to trace this out a little bit. And I think there are at least two sets of reasons for this. And one of them, and this was really the main reason for my slides, is because I have some graphs to show. So when you look at what has shifted, and what I mean by state-society relations is sort of fiscal policies have changed, fiscal and social policies. And I'll illustrate with these two sets of graphs. So every war, basically each one of these spikes before before World War II, each of the major spikes corresponds to a major war. So you have, every time there's a major war, the US would initiate a war tax. So what that does is that's obviously increasing your tax to GDP ratio. What you can see very clearly after World War II is that those levels don't go back down. So some political economists refer to that as the Ratchet Effect for this particular case. And so taxes have remained tax revenues have remained relatively high. Meanwhile, or one of the reasons for that is this, and I actually have seen this in a heritage document. This is more my clever language, the waning of the warfare state and the waxing of the welfare state. And so that basically means, I think this sort of runs contrary to, I think, a conventional wisdom, which is always, well, defense budgets are huge and, it's crowding out social spending. And when you look at this is actually not what's happening. And so you can see that entitlement programs are actually having that opposite effect. So they're crowding, I don't know if it's crowding out defense, but defense is at a relative, I mean, it's at a historic low as a percentage of the federal budget. And so what these two, this sort of state-society relations, the argument here is that, as you see here, tax rates are relatively high. This is basically a proxy for your tax levels. They never go back down. So you have high-ish peacetime levels relative to historic rates. And you have basically sort of a bipartisan commitment to these social programs that arose in the 30s and 40s. So what you get is a bipartisan antipathy toward higher taxes, a bipartisan antipathy toward cutting social spending. And so you end up, what I argue, is a sort of ceiling effect, that now it's really difficult to raise taxes for issue-specific reasons. And so that means, and this is something that comes through very much in the research I've done, is that when you ask people, well, would you support a war tax? That's double taxation. What's next? An air tax. So people that now the norm on this is so different because there's a sense that they don't want the a la carte taxation. They've given their tax money and that should fund everything, including the sort of the largesse of the social programs. And so that's a key thing that has changed, is that commitment to the social programs, but also sort of concurrent with that is the fact that tax increases now have remained unpopular. So this is actually, I don't know if this is okay to say, this is AEI data on what people think about taxation. So this is probably not surprising that most people think their taxes are too high, very comparatively few, a minority about right, and only 2%, contrary to what I think we're seeing today with this sense that everyone supports a 70% tax rate. That's not what the evidence generally has historically suggested. Research on the political economy of taxation shows that there is kind of a punitive element to the leaders who try to increase taxes before an election, also fairly intuitive. So you can see why now in this kind of post-World War II climate, why you would get some aversion to taxes as the way to finance wars. But there's maybe a less or more intuitive second reason, which is a change in the military people will say, well, the nature of war doesn't change. Clausewitz would tell us that the nature of war doesn't change. Okay, the character of war, which is that after World War II, with the advent of nuclear weapons, major wars, and people have different arguments. Steven Pinker would say that major war is no longer a thing for other reasons. I think nuclear weapons have had the effect of putting a lid on escalation. And so I think what you have is you don't have a direct confrontation because both sides know that the stakes are too high. So you end up with these lower intensity conflicts. And this is Mario Cuomo from 1995. I mean, it's a much longer quote than this that I start out my concluding chapter with. And I think there's a lot about this that I think it makes a lot of sense. The World War II, you had Mussolini, you have Hitler, and then the illustrative case, and this is sort of proximate to when he was talking about this in 95, is the Persian Gulf War. And he says, everyone thinks we get it. And that's like, is it oil? Is it who am I fighting for? Who's the emir anyway? Where is my son going? And so these wars are much sort of more, they're less existential. They're harder for Americans to kind of wrap their heads around. And so the unintended consequence of this is, I don't know if any of you follow Steve Walt on Twitter, but this is 2014, and I still kind of like this. U.S. grant strategy. The stakes aren't that high, and it's not worth much sacrifice in lives and treasure. And so I think what we see now is that kind of this pernicious cycle of the wars seem like they're not worth the stakes. The political leaders sort of lack the courage to solicit sacrifice. And my own research has shown that for sort of conditional on how wars are funded, if you propose a war tax, support declines by between 15 and 20%. So leaders, I think, are savvy on this, and they don't want to incur political risk by introducing war taxes. And so you see this historically, and I think really the last major war, so Vietnam really is this turning point where you have kind of this illustration of this gray zone. Is it war? Is it peace? We're going to kind of shroud the cost of war. But Johnson here is quite clear about what he's trying to do here by avoiding a war tax. And he says, I don't know much about economics, which is true, but I do know Congress, and I can get the Great Society through right now But if I talk about the cost of the war, the Great Society won't go through. And again, it's this sort of guns and butter thing, where he turns this into not a guns versus butter, but let's just have it all, the whole enchilada, the guns and the butter, but let's just not talk about it. And so shroud the cost of the war by not having the war tax. And there's a lot more sort of verbiage on the part of LBJ that's tying this debate that would inevitably take place about a war tax to his aversion to actually having a real democratic debate about the war. So the last war tax is 1968. And I think the lessons were really internalized since then. But I also think that we see this in these recent wars. You know, Afghanistan started in one way that I think everyone could get behind. We're now in the 18th year of this war, and so I just put up a couple of these strategic objectives of the war. And so this is McChrystal, which just I thought really, no pun intended, crystallized the difficulty here, which is, you know, he's asking his aides, do you think we can get to Bangladesh level corruption? And this is like a major strategic objective of the Afghanistan war. And so so Bangladesh, I don't think, is known for its low levels of corruption. It's I was looking, and it's about 168th on the sort of transparency and corruption indicators. So it's not really high. So if you say to the American public, we want you to commit some of your resources, and if you do, we might get in Afghanistan down to Bangladesh level corruption. That's not really a great pitch for fiscal sacrifice. One of the others that I thought was really interesting is, and this is an indicator of success in Afghanistan, is how many steps does it take to get a driver's license in Afghanistan? And you might think, like, why does that matter? Well, it turns out every one of those steps is an opportunity for graft. And corruption then is a proxy for sort of being able to create stable conditions on the ground in Afghanistan. Again, though, this starts to sound like foreign aid. And most Americans think we spend too much on foreign aid. And you're getting, again, this sort of blurring of lines between what's war, what's peace, why should we care, why should this count for anything? And so what we get then is again, the political elites that are saying, let's just not talk about it, like nothing to see here. And so I think there are real policy implications of this. So if we come back to Kant and sort of what makes democratic conduct different from non-democracies, and the reason why wars used to be sort of shorter and more accountable is that you had skin in the game. So here, this is duration in months of major U.S. wars, and you know it's kind of eye-opening the degree to which this has corresponded to the shift in the way we finance the wars and what we ask in terms of sort of sacrifice from the public. And what I would argue is, again, this sort of unraveling of the accountability that leads to kind of these wars that continue without end. And again, you know, all these things are multi-causal, but you know, it's also not surprising that if you're not raising taxes, your debt rates are going up as well. So I think that there are real implications in terms of not just democratic accountability, but sort of fiscal responsibility as well. So I think this is again a real policy challenge, because the whole reason why leaders are averse to this in the first place is why it would make it difficult to engage in the kind of thing that would give Americans kind of skin in the game. So in the Iraq War, when the Marine Commandant, you know, Bob Woodward's accounting, so for what it's worth, but he had proposed a 5-cent gas tax, and he had said that, you know, the problem with these wars is that Americans are just on the sidelines. They're just spectators. They have no skin in the game. And he proposed this 5-cent gas tax would give Americans sort of a reason to care. He said that Americans continue to be spectators, unwilling to change their habits. But I think what we see is that politicians are unwilling to change their habits as well. And I think there are reasons why that is. But I think until they're willing to change that, we're going to continue kind of with the recent past being prologue of sort of these unaccountable wars and the rising debt levels. So I think on that really optimistic note, I would look forward to your comments and questions from the audience.
Thank you so much. And before I start my questions, I just wanted to say that I truly enjoyed reading your book. That's why there are so many notes on it. And opened my eyes to a different academic literature that I didn't know, like on the relationship with that and the ability to conduct war and all those questions that I thought was fascinating. So thank you for your work on that. My main takeaway from the book is the impossible trinity that you describe, in which the defense budget operates. The three reinforcing factors for the few of you that have not read the book is the need for extra defense resources, the unwillingness to raise taxes due to the ceiling effect that you described on your presentation, and the public's desire to maintain current welfare programs. If you have those three components together, it is really challenging for any politician to make an argument that you need more resources for defense, either to face China or to continue doubling down in Afghanistan, whatever purpose it might be. It becomes really challenging to make that to have a case that is compelling enough and well received by the public. Can you talk to the audience about how those three factors work together and what is how the impossible trinity factors in?
So I'm glad you were so attentive on this. I was taking notes on my apparently what's in my book, but as I was doing that, my pen ran out of ink. So. So the need for more defense, thank you, need for more defense resources, sustaining the current welfare programs, and the debt. And you
No, unwillingness to raise taxes.
Unwillingness.
Because of the
Well, so
ceiling
right,
effect.
right. Oh, the high peacetime tax rates, yeah. So I think, and it's sort of what I was trying to get at with this idea of the state-society relations, which is that, and this sort of surprised me a little bit as someone that thinks of I think of myself as a fiscal conservative, and looking at these programs over the 30s and 40s, and looking at sort of the political elites that one would have expected to sort of push back. And what was interesting to me is the rapidity with which that political opposition atrophied. And I think it's the kind of thing that, a little bit what we saw with the Affordable Care Act and the sort of post-2016, a lot, the members of Congress and the president that campaign on repealing Obamacare, and it turns out that a lot of their constituents, once they had it, don't want to give that up. And I think that's a lot of what you see in public opinion data is that Americans will say, we want lower taxes and more services. That's just untenable. Like, you cannot do that in a way that is fiscally responsible. Something has to give, and so once you start to ask questions in a way that force trade-offs, people get really uncomfortable, and I think again these political elites do as well. And so the easiest thing, and I think this isn't something we've talked about yet, but I do think this is a consideration, is that the U.S. kind of has this luxury in a way because it is the world's reserve currency, the dollar has been strong, and so it can kind of get away with the debt increasing. And so that's kind of the thing that gives, is that, that's how you kind of reconcile this trinity, is you just kind of gain a degree of fiscal irresponsibility.
And that ties into the second question that I have. It's because you have a public perception that you paid too much taxes already, but that is artificially created by annual deficits. So the government is delivering around $1 of value for every 75 cents that you pay, because the government is borrowing around $1 trillion a year for a budget of $4 trillion. So you have that inflated perception of what the government can achieve and how much money the government has to do things. And that, in my mind, goes to the welfare state as well, because, or mainly to the welfare state, because you have that inflated sense of what the government can achieve, and you feel that you already pay enough of taxes, so you're not willing to do anything else, and you're not willing to move. And you point to the distortion and how that distortion on the perception affects the support for war. And I think there is a fascinating book to be written about how that distortion affects the welfare state as well, and affects the perception of activities on welfare state. And I just wanted to get your opinion on it. Do you think that that is a fair reading of your argument?
Right. So one of the reasons why I wanted to kind of look cross nationally at this, because I was interested whether this was just an American thing, and I think the U.S. takes it to a much takes it to the next level because it is this large and like huge economy. But I see a very similar trend in other advanced industrialized democracies. Is that sort of this? And I talk about the case of Denmark, for example, and we sort of hold them up as kind of this like the Scandinavian model of where they value kind of the social welfare state. Well, Denmark's an interesting case because they also have a pretty, they've another paper that looked at Denmark's role in the Afghanistan war, and as a percentage of the population, and as they were contributing more troops than I think any other country. So they have a pretty robust defense and contribution to NATO. But what was interesting when you talk to their defense analysts is that they're doing the same thing we are. That they don't want to make trade-offs. No one wants to make trade-offs, but the public certainly doesn't want to give up social programs in the name of defense. And so they just kind of massage the, kind of like our overseas contingency operations is like, well, we're just gonna that's the spending, and we're not gonna ask too many questions about that. And it's sort of like a bit of obfuscation to avoid the really tough political questions and decisions that these countries want to make. So I think the U.S. sort of illustrates the problem, but I think it's endemic to a lot of other democracies.
It almost seems like we rehearsed this, but that was my next question was about the overseas contingency operations account and how that increases the perception of being able to fight wars on the cheap, because you remove a lot of the resources that should be within the defense budget to a separate account, and that doesn't show up all the time in the top line, and then requires a lot of people to just raise their hand all the time, say, oh no, what it really has as well, it has this whole separate account that you need to consider as well. You can't just ignore it. And I think that contributes to the public misunderstanding and misperception of what it takes to fight those wars, and to keep the military that we have, and to task the military the way we have tasked so far. And is there any reason why you did not touch on supplemental appropriations and INOCO in your book? Because that is a recent that's a recent change. Historically, you have those supplemental appropriations and they get incorporated into the base budget, but that has not been the case in the last 17 years or so.
Mm-hmm. But I would argue that goes back even to Vietnam. And so if you look at the Vietnam War, and again, kind of these like budgetary gymnastics to make this appear as though it's not war. I mean, if, this whole sort of process of gradual escalation, let's have this not be seen as a real war. Even in the Korean War, Truman calling it a police action. And I think it's very convenient for leaders to, and I would especially say where the strategic objectives become a bit more, less existential, that it's very convenient for leaders to be able to kind of shunt this to the side, put it in the, overseas contingency operations, call it not war, have gradual escalation. Well, we just have 30,000 military advisors, Vietnam, like they're not really doing anything. And then before you know it, and one of the examples of this recently that this is maybe a year or two ago, when Lindsey Graham, Armed Services, says, oh, I had no idea we had 10,000 troops in Africa. And so even for the, that is his job to be aware of that. And it becomes really easy to just kind of, it's all over there. And I think it's because he's not getting pushback until a couple of people died. And then it's kind of this, and that's sort of the argument, this is the Kantian logic, which is that's when people pay attention. Once their brothers and sisters are dying and sons and daughters are dying in war, they start to care. But until that time, there's sort of less, again, the sort of less skin in the game that gives people fewer, and again, the sort of idea that this is very politically convenient for members of Congress who have limited time in their days. Do they want to spend it dealing with angry constituents on this? Do they want to spend it finagling the budget? It's easier just to kind of take that off the agenda.
And you mentioned that the main vector for accountability, I mean, the thrust of your book is that you need to have financial skin in the game in order to generate any accountability for governmental action in a way. Because that's one interesting thing that I thought throughout reading your book is that a lot of the arguments that you make apply not just to conducting war, but to any governmental activity. Like you need to pay attention to what the government is doing, not just with its military, but also with your healthcare or how it's affecting financial regulations. All those aspects are also related to a matter of accountability and how, and if your government is doing what you believe it's right. And you mentioned in your previous answer now that there's the blood and the treasure as the levers of getting the public to pay attention. Is there any other one? Is there any one that is more effective than the other?
So I think the one that gets it might be sort of an apples and oranges thing, to use a crude metaphor, I guess, but because I think these register in very different ways. I did some social science experiments to try to gauge how the public weighs those, and they surprisingly do in relatively commensurate ways. So, I cited this number that when you give someone a hypothetical war and say it will be financed through war taxes or financed through borrowing, and the tax level, when the support conditional on it being financed through taxes goes down by 15 to 20%. And that's the same with casualties. The problem, though, if for people who are familiar with, social psychology, political psychology, is that it's hard to sort of give someone a piece of paper and say, this is how you're going to feel with this sort of hypothetical casualty or a hypothetical tax. My sense, though, is that sort of the visceral nature of a casualty still registers in much more salient ways than would be the case for a war tax. And again, I think this case of these 4 individuals who died, special forces in Niger, illustrates that, which is that the U.S. was conducting operations in Niger long before these casualties. Some of it was drones, some of it was all sort of like very little sense that there were palpable costs until these 4 members died. And suddenly there's a political awareness of this that then leads to congressional hearings and greater scrutiny as to what actually is going on there. Now, you could argue that that is short-lived, our 24-hour, less than that news cycle. But at least it gets it on the radar in a way that it hadn't otherwise.
Okay. And my last question before I open up to the audience. On page 207, you mentioned that the tradition of debt finance has become so entrenched that war taxes seem peculiar, almost like a historical anachronism. And my softball there is, do you think we should start having war taxes? Or do you see as the ideal mechanism to finance a war?
So what I think is incredibly interesting about this, and just by way of sort of seeing whether this travels to countries other than the U.S., is that I was trying to find a case. So what scenario would cause Americans to say, you know what, we're ready to open our wallets and give money for this war, this 5-cent gas tax, or the case of World War II. The polls are just super interesting on this, that there was a congressional proposal for a certain level of war taxes, and Gallup asked people, what would you be willing to pay? People said basically 150% of, so 1.5 times what Congress was proposing. I thought, what would get us back to that scenario where the Americans were just ready for like the fiscal, any kind of sacrifice? And so I looked at the sort of the closest case I could find. So in 2015, 3 days after that major terrorist attack in France, And so a colleague and I did basically a snap poll in Paris to ask people whether they would be willing to kind of pay a security tax for counterterrorism. And the support for this was about 19%. And so this is, the president had said this is an act of war, we're in a state of emergency. So even in France, which you would think France is kind of less hostile to taxes than the United States is, that there might be some sort of greater willingness to tolerate this, but it was exactly the same level as in the United States. So that when we queried this in 2011 and 12 of Americans to support an Afghanistan war tax, it was 19%. So people just think that this is anathema to how we do business. And so I think anything along those lines is likely to remain unpopular. But I do think, there's some members of Congress, and this is not a partisan issue. This seems to be more an ideological issue where you get some kind of members of the Mike Lee kind of Rand Paul side of the right and the Ron Wyden, Tom Udall side of the left that can kind of agree that there needs to be kind of more at stake here, that there needs to be more buy-in from the public and more accountability from Congress. And I think that's probably the direction that this needs to go to be able to kind of restore some of those accountability linkages.
Perfect. Any questions from the audience? Just wait for the mic and please make your question in the form of a question. Start collecting back to.
Thanks for coming here. I think you've made a very strong, cogent argument for, incorporating a tax to make the American public feel more connected to a conflict. In one of your slides, you kind of showed a comparison of duration of wars.
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering if during your comparative analysis, if it was more strongly correlated the duration toward having a tax associated to that war, or the duration was more associated to how clear the strategic objectives were and the policy objectives. And you kind of, cited General McChrystal's, I guess, quote, and then just made a reference to World War II and people's willingness. It seems like World War II, there was a very clear threat and clear objectives, whereas Afghanistan, it's still kind of like an airplane being built in flight.
Mm-hmm. So I would say that these factors are completely related, which is the reason why you're willing to get leaders kind of asking for sacrifice and the public willing to sacrifice in World War II is because of those clear national stakes. And so part of the argument is that one reason you don't get that anymore is that again, Steven Pinker would say that, well, it's the better angels of our nature. We just aren't a hostile people anymore. I don't know that I necessarily buy that. I do buy the deterrent aspects of nuclear weapons. I think that to me, that's a really persuasive argument, is that you have major powers that have nuclear weapons. They do not want to go to war because it's just too damn costly. And so what do? They fight at the periphery. They fight these sort of, in the sense that it's not like the U.S. is going to use nuclear weapons in Afghanistan. And as part of this is the nuclear taboo. Part of this is so there's a lot wrapped up in this. But then you end up in these wars with the how many steps does it take to get a driver's license? Those kinds of wars, and those are not persuasive to the American public, and so you end up in this more pernicious cycle where those kinds of measures that might otherwise have been possible in previous wars become kind of impossible in these recent ones.
Oh no, the mic is there. Oh, sorry. Oh, and please introduce yourself.
My name is Dr. Rob Malik. I'm a Fulbright scholar currently at the Elliott School. I think it's a very good account of what's been happening, but I think we need to look at the future. And I want to ask you a question regarding the maintenance of the global order as we see it in the West, for example, and the rivalry that is increasing now from the East vis-a-vis China, and their unlikely acceptance of our democratic norms, for example. So when it comes down to this, and the fact that we will probably be heading into a scenario where we're in another Cold War, per se, maybe not to the extent that we were before, how are we going to persuade the public that this is an existential threat, that the rise of China is existentially threatening to their way of, the way of life here? I'm from England, so it's not very different. We have problems there as well, but for me, I'm writing a book on this, so for me to understand how to get money out of the public, which is what it really is, how do we persuade them that we're going into a long-term potential conflict now as well? And taxation may be one of them, I think.
So this is a really important question. It's something I thought a lot about. When I was working on the book, is this like a historical teleology where, like, once we're moving in this inexorable direction and we can't kind of go back to a way in which things were done before? And the question of China came up in my mind. So what if the U.S. were engaged in a hot war with China, where we're back to 38% of our GDP spending on defense? And I mean, I guess time will tell, but I think that scenario is it strikes me as unimaginable. And in part, I mean, I think this comes back to the question of nuclear weapons. And so the U.S. and Soviet Union were hostile for many years. And I think that chart shows it really well, is sort of this decline. You have now this tension between the welfare and the warfare state. But I would subscribe to the idea that the commitment to the welfare state among the population is stronger than it is to the warfare state. And that what that means is that that kind of keeps basically a low-level appetite for any kind of conflict that will require any kind of sacrifice and any kind of distortion of the way of life that they're used to. Some of that is probably good, because it may mean that we don't engage in the Dr. Strangelove kind of wars where you go, well, 5 million, 10 million, I didn't say your hair wouldn't get mussed, like those kinds of wars, I think are relatively unlikely, because both in part because of the nuclear weapons, but also kind of this historical move away from major war. Maybe this is nodding towards Steven Pinker, I don't know, but I also think it's interesting the way these different sides are preparing for that kind of conflict. You talk to people in the military, and they seem to be quite averse to, and this makes a lot of sense, an all-out ground war with China, because that doesn't necessarily seem winnable. It's again, like Reagan said, is that you do not want to, neither side will win that kind of war. And so there's no reason to fight that in the first place.
Can I just add to that slide?
Sure. As long as you.
I know it's not a discussion. I'm not teaching for the next year or so I get an opportunity to say something sometimes. We like talking, don't we?
We do.
But for my understanding is that the less or the more resistant you are to accepting a potential war, that you want to avoid it, the more likely it might occur, because China is coming up. And we can see that everywhere. There was a discussion this morning in the Brookings, and the admiral in charge of the naval operations, for example, was talking about the necessity to maintain capacity and capabilities at all levels and surpass any other competitor is necessary. And that cost is increasing exponentially as the days go by, because technology is getting more expensive. And they're ratcheting up their technology base massively as well. So you get to a point where you have no choice, because you want to maintain your system as it is now. Or are you willing to compromise and mesh in some type of future global system. This is what we're really talking about. A global system where their say comes into it, but they're not going to accept our values either. So that's where I'm trying to get to, I think, as far as money is concerned.
Right. I mean, and I think the best outcome is because you're right. I think what you're also getting at is the only way for deterrence to work is for it to be mutually painful for both sides to think about engaging in conflict. And the only way for it to hurt is like Thomas Schelling, is to spend some resources on that, on defense and retaliation. And so I think the U.S. has not shown that it's backing away from that necessarily. But even still, again, you look at sort of as a percentage of GDP, that's relatively low. That the U.S. is, was it like 3.8% on defense, and again, you do have some trade-offs. I mean, eventually, you do have the guns butter trade-off, and it seems as though the social programs are, to a large extent, winning that one, and so it raises, I think, these, in some ways, these fundamental questions that all political elites seem to have incentives to kick down the road, right? It's a partial answer.
Hi, Rachel Zestimos with the Heritage Foundation. So your dates for when war taxing stopped coincide pretty well with the establishment of the all-volunteer force and a peacetime professional military. Do you think that has anything to do with it, in the fact that it's not really war spending anymore so much as defense spending? And do you think in order to have a tax, there'd have to be a clearer delineation of defense spending or spending for the military and spending on war specifically? So OCO versus, base budget.
Right. So it's a really good question. I think these things are hard to disentangle. And I would say that some of this is some of what you're talking about, kind of the move to the all-volunteer military or force, AVF, and the move away from the war taxes are sort of two sides of the same coin. And it's in part because of the wars that the U.S. started fighting became this kind of less existential, less sort of the stakes seemed less high, and probably more than anything else, but that state-society relationship that I talked about, where the U.S. kind of values other things now increasingly, and where that meets in the middle is that these political leaders want to kind of keep political debates about war, kind of off the table, because it's sort of there's a political scientist, David Mayhew, who wrote about Congress, the electoral connection, and he talks about the opportunity cost of members' time. And I think this makes a lot of sense. And if constituents have started to value other things, they want to be devoting less time to these debates as well. And I think that is the consequence of this is both the shift for the all volunteer military and the move away from war taxes, where they just kind of want to keep this off the table and keep political debates low. To disentangle this, again, though, becomes really hard. And I think you have to do this through, the Vietnam case. Really makes it just, the problem is that all of these things kind of, there's a confluence. They all kind of happen in 1968, and the U.S. kind of loses. It's the Tet Offensive. It's the war tax. It's now you're sort of shifting. But what you see kind of in terms of kind of the evidence is that the war tax in this case does become this lightning rod. It does become something very concrete and tangible for individuals to kind of engage as the cost to them in a way that helps mobilize, you get these hundreds of thousands of people marching in protest to the war. But, there are a lot of things have changed. And I have a piece with in Foreign Affairs with someone who works on the medical impact of battlefield kind of medicine. And that's a really interesting one, because it used to be that for every individual killed in action, you had 4 casualties, 4 wounded. Now you have 10. And so again, a lot of these changes are for the good, that you're having fewer battlefield casualties, let's say for the same kind of shrapnel wound. But that's another way in which people, if you don't have a fatality, it's not resonating in the same way as a member who's coming back wounded, even if the costs to that person and his family and society are quite high. And so I think all of these are just sort of different manifestations of the ways in which conflict has receded from the foreground of people's kind of consciousness to the background in a way that kind of erodes the accountability linkages and makes that kind of less salient for individuals, less salient for members of Congress, and you end up with these kind of pretty open-ended conflicts.
Unless that, sir, in the back.
I wondered what your feelings are on U.S. savings bonds. The Second World War was financed to a great extent by the savings bonds. Today, the IRA and the Keogh accounts have sort of supplanted the savings bonds, basically due to tax reasons. You put away your money there, there's no tax on it for many, many years, whereas a savings bond, you have plenty of tax on it. Maybe there's a need to try to provide, a 50% provision for no tax on your interest income to try to help sell them. The rates are very low, which doesn't help. Years ago, the rates were higher, but that's how it is. But I wondered, President Lincoln sent the bands out all over the North to try to finance the war by war bonds and whatnot. But there we have the savings bond. But maybe there's a way to reinvigorate it.
So that seems like a great suggestion. I always feel like I am so pessimistic on the sort of prognosis for this, but that strikes me as a really fruitful way that is also potentially politically palatable to actually kind of restore these linkages. I think that's an interesting idea. I appreciate it.
So take one last question, please, Tom.
Thanks, Dr. Kreps, for coming. We've kind of hinted around this. There's probably some learned quote that I don't know that talks about security or foreign affairs is too important to be left to a democracy. I'm sure we could find something from Athens or something like that. But and you've kind of hinted about this, but given the antipathy people have towards taxing for their security, you've described this, is an argument to be made, and maybe you made it in your book, that given that, nations would be way too reluctant to engage in conflict because they see this price tag coming right around the corner. And I think about Britain in like 1935, who chose to focus internally versus confronting the German threat as they were violating the treaty and stuff like that. And so is there a danger? I mean, at Heritage, we love accountability. That should be in our elevator, but it's not. Is there a danger that too much accountability would lead to nations ignoring a looming threat, and that they would say, you know what, I know that's a problem, but we can't afford to handle something like that?
So I think that was a much more eloquent answer than the one I was giving to this gentleman right here. That was exactly what I was trying to say.
Yeah.
I think that's exactly the point, is that I think we do risk kind of this appeasement kind of grand strategy because we just don't want to pay for it. And so the politically attractive compromise from the right and the left is just to kind of like throttle back and disengage because the Americans don't want to bear the cost, and the politicians don't want to have to make the hard choices.
Or have to explain the hard choices that they're making. With that, thank you so much for coming over. I really appreciate your talk, Dr. Kreps. We have books for sale outside, and it's going to be by the place just by the entrance. And now there's some sandwiches over there as well for lunch. And Professor Kreps will be available here to sign any books if you're so inclined. Thank you so much, and thank you.